We've seen walls built around Washington, and we feel like we can't quite get through.
Some 60 Americans are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
For millions of Americans, this may be the worst weekend they've ever faced for finding gasoline to give them the automobile freedom they take as their due.
UNFTR.
Welcome to the third and final installment of the Carter years. Carter's foreign policy team continued to pick up Kissinger's pieces all over the world. Brzezinski in particular was determined to set himself apart from the controversial Kissinger, who frequently undermined him in the press. Early in 1978, Ziebig conducted under-the-radar meetings with Deng Xiaoping and was enthusiastically promoting China throughout the White House upon his return, prompting Carter to accuse him of being seduced. But the breakthrough was real, and in short order, the United States and China formally opened diplomatic and trade relations, thus ushering in the modern economic era. But for as much as 1979 was brimming with promise, the world was slowly beginning to unravel. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, better known as the Shah of Iran, enjoyed a long dictatorial tenure during which he sought to make Iran a major economic player on the international stage. And he had the support of Western allies in particular, who safeguarded his time as a leader. In 1978, however, with unrest among youths growing in the streets, the Shah's military opened fire on protesters in Tehran. Religious fervor had already captivated many of the youth in Iran's cities, and right-wing clerics seized upon this horrific event to stoke the flames of unrest. By the end of the year, the Shah's position and grip on power became untenable, and the exiled leader of the religious right, Ruhollah Khomeini, known as the Ayatollah Khomeini, returned triumphantly from exile to take power and turn the government of Iran into an Islamic theocracy. The Shah's ouster shocked the world and unfortunately caught the Carter administration completely off guard. We'll return to this crucial part of the story shortly, but the important takeaway here is the utter failure of the intelligence community to grasp what was happening on the ground. Carter looked even more out of touch, having recently hosted the Shah in the United States and calling him a trusted friend. Now, behind the scenes, ironically, Carter had been the Shah's harshest critic compared to previous administrations. Because Carter had crafted his foreign policy around a humanitarian first principle, he admonished the Shah from the start for wielding too heavy of a hand. An important historical note about the Shah's relationship with the United States is the extremely close relationship between him and members of the Trilateral Commission, David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger being chief among them. While Carter turned his attention elsewhere, Rockefeller and Kissinger would begin a covert campaign to protect their interests behind Carter's back. Carter's problem at home and abroad were beginning to mount. Inflation was proving to be a real issue, and the trouble in Iran wasn't helping matters. Across the globe, the economy was cooling off, and Carter's insistence on tightening the belt domestically also wasn't helping matters. In just a few months, the administration went from the high of the Camp David Accords, domestic legislative successes, and the opening of relations with China, to playing defense on several fronts. And the Washington press corps wasn't helping either. In their relentless pursuit of scandal, they were beginning to tire of the president's squeaky clean image and started looking for trouble whenever and wherever possible. And because the good old boys in particular didn't fit into the Katharine Graham-style Washington mold, they were constantly being picked apart in the gossip and opinion pages, and it was beginning to wear them down. Between inflation, another gas crisis due to the Iranian Revolution, Ziebig and Vance sniping at each other, and unemployment beginning to creep up, the president's numbers were flagging. And then the beginning of the end came in an article penned by a former ally and employee in the White House who broke everyone's heart and spirit. In May of 1979, an article appeared in The Atlantic titled "The Passionless Presidency." It was written by former staffer and speechwriter James Fallows. Fallows was a young journalist who was wooed by a friend to join Carter's team. While not his first choice for a career, the upside was undeniable, and so he put his career on hold to join the executive team. And Fallows was well liked by pretty much everyone, including Carter, which made his critique that much more devastating. In our frenetic 24/7 news cycle today, it's hard to appreciate how much weight a single article could carry. But it helps cement in the public's mind what was going on behind the scenes in the White House. and it would haunt the Carter team for the rest of their lives. Fallows believed he was simply doing his job after leaving the White House just a few months earlier. He was a witness. This was a first-hand account. It was his obligation. And the piece did start off with some extremely positive characterizations of Jimmy Carter, the man. Quote, "After 2.5 years in Carter's service, I fully believe him to be a good man. With his moral virtues and his intellectual skills, he is perhaps as admirable a human being as has ever held the job. He's probably smarter in the College Board sense than any other president in this century. He grasps issues quickly. He made me feel confident that, except in economics, he would resolve technical questions lucidly without distortions. In his ability to do justice case by case, he would be the ideal non-lawyer for the Supreme Court. If I had to choose one politician to sit at the pearly gates and pass judgment on my soul, Jimmy Carter would be the one." End quote. The pleasantries end there. For the next several thousand words, Fallows eviscerates the administration. Here are some excerpts, all quotations. "Carter and those closest to him took office in profound ignorance of their jobs. The president seemed to foresee neither the temptations nor the demands of foreign policy, nor the ways to prevent them from stealing his concentration away from other pressing business of his office. He did not know how congressmen talked, worked, and thought, how to pressure them without being a bully or flatter them without seeming a fool. If there has been little abuse of power, it may be because they have so little sense of what power is and how it might be exercised. I came to think that Carter believes 50 things, but no one thing. He's a smart man, but not an intellectual in the sense of liking the play of ideas, of pushing concepts to their limits to examine their implications." The piece borders on harsh truths and slight inaccuracies, but it was the first-hand nature of it that made it so damning, especially because Fallows left on pretty good terms. And these highlights are just that, a smattering of criticisms among a torrent. In hindsight, if ever there was a turning point in a tragic story, this was it. Now, lest we forget, the nation was still in the midst of the Cold War. The extent of the decline within the Soviet apparatus was still unclear in the West, though there was some hope within the Carter administration that relations were beginning to thaw. Most pressing on the diplomatic agenda was to revive the stalled SALT treaty talks with the Soviets. Most within the administration believed that productive talks were within reach, and there seemed to be a greater level of trust in the U.S. without Kissinger as the point person. But there was one major obstacle from within: Ziebig. Quote, "Relations between Vance and Brzezinski were obviously getting frayed. Brzezinski continued to badger the president to link passage of the SALT Treaty with the Soviet behavior in Angola, Zaire, Yemen, and eventually Afghanistan," writes Kai Bird. Undaunted, President Carter met with Soviet Chairman Brezhnev in Vienna and signed the SALT II agreement designed to establish parity between the nations in nuclear delivery systems and to limit the number of multiple warhead missiles. The reality was that the treaty did little to slow the arms race, but the Carter team believed it to be an important step in opening a dialogue and transparency between the two countries. Unfortunately, the American public saw it differently. Neither side of the aisle in the U.S. was particularly happy about the negotiations. The right saw Carter as a sellout, and the left saw it as wholly inadequate. Carter's people still needed to ratify the treaty in Congress, but this wasn't Panama, and Carter was beginning to lose influence within his own party. Carter was aware that his grip was slowly slipping on important matters. The Fallows article had shaken the confidence of his internal team, and Ziebig and Vance were increasingly at odds, especially over the SALT talks. In July, a White House pollster and polarizing figure named Patrick Cadell, whom a Carter associate once referred to as Rasputin, planted a bug in Carter's ear. He suggested a summit with top Democratic leaders and officials from around the country to earnestly diagnose what ailed the nation. The idea was that Carter had taken his eye off the ball pursuing foreign policy and was quickly losing touch with the pulse of the country. Many were surprised when Carter took Cadell's advice and cleared the White House calendar. For several days, he gathered with Democratic leaders and listened intently and genuinely to their criticisms and advice. Those in attendance would later remark, somewhat in awe, how Carter absorbed criticism and encouraged honest feedback. It was a stunning display of humility and genuine concern for the nation. Again, Bird. Quote, after 10 days, on July 14, 1979, Carter came down from Catoctin Mountain Park and spent the next day editing the speech that would ultimately become a turning point in his presidency. He spoke for 33 minutes, end quote.
It's clear that the true problems of our nation are much deeper than gasoline lines or energy shortages, deeper even than inflation or recession. So I want to speak to you first tonight about a subject even more serious than energy or inflation. I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. I do not mean our political and civil liberties. They will endure. And I do not refer to the outward strength of America, a nation that is at peace tonight everywhere in the world, with unmatched economic power and military might. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence.
The speech has been referred to both as the malaise speech and the crisis of confidence speech. Either way, the immediate impact of it was palpable, and for a brief moment, the American people were galvanized in support of their president, who was delivering tough love and speaking to them as peers and from the heart. Carter wrote every word of the speech himself, and it did resonate with average Americans for a while. But the problems he identified outside of the crisis of confidence were bigger than a momentary motivational speech. There were gas lines, inflation was brutal, jobs were being lost. The economic realities were ever present in the American mind, and they were certainly more important to voters than some conservative regime in Iran or mediocre treaties with the Soviets. People wanted a leader to take hold of domestic affairs and assure them that everything was going to work out. That piece Carter did tap into, and it came from one particular attendee at the summit who put it bluntly and succinctly to Carter in words that stuck with him. Quote, Mr. President, you are not leading this nation. You're just managing the government, end quote. The reason this moment stuck with Carter and all those in attendance is because it struck at the heart of the problem with Carter's style. So yes, the speech did work for a time, but the harsh economic realities would ultimately prove to be too overwhelming. And like so many other seemingly insignificant moments, the cardigan sweater, scheduling time for tennis, solar panels on the White House, the speech would eventually be woven into a larger loser narrative that Carter was built for small ball but not up to the moment. In the end, the American people didn't want to be leveled with. They just wanted someone to fix things. By the way, the summit attendee who offered that insightful critique was a newly elected Southern governor named Bill Clinton. Inflation was ripping. This period will forever be studied by economists, and whether or not the eventual cure for inflation was worth it or even right will be argued for just as long. Either way, it was clear that double-digit inflation was unsustainable for the American people. As usual, Americans viewed stagflation, which is a slowdown of economic growth combined with high inflation and rising unemployment, as a uniquely American experience. So naturally, the blame fell squarely on Carter. The truth is, the entire world was being ravaged by inflation. Western Europe, Japan, hyperinflation in parts of Latin America. Of course, it was happening in the Soviet bloc as well, though we just didn't know how bad it was. Carter finally got the message and made a bold call. Now, we can litigate this, and our audience knows that this is a favorite topic of mine, but Carter's call was to select a controversial figure to head the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker. Volcker was a big, blustering figure who graduated from Princeton, where he wrote his thesis on how to curb inflation after World War II. He was loud, opinionated, and kind of unpopular. In short, the antithesis of Carter. But Carter was taken by his honesty and was looking to demonstrate leadership on the inflation issue. His old friend Bert Lance, this was a guy who had been by Carter's side forever, chimed in after the fact saying, quote, if he appoints Volcker, he'll be mortgaging his re-election to the Federal Reserve, end quote. How right he was. Inside the White House, there were very few supporters. Even Vice President Mondale was nervous about his selection because he understood Volcker's belief system and what was likely to follow. As Byrd writes, quote, The vice president feared that Volcker's predilection for tough monetary policies would cause an unnecessary recession, end quote. Lance and Mondale would both be correct. In addition to multiple staggering rate hikes that boosted the prime rate and therefore mortgage rates and everything else tied to Fed rates, Volcker simultaneously constricted money supply by requiring banks to hold larger reserves. Less money on the street, and what was available was expensive. It was shock therapy that would eventually pay off, but long after the Carter presidency and well into Reagan's first term. It was only a matter of time. The mudslide was in full swing. The coveted position that Democrats enjoyed coming into 1977 was looking increasingly bleak. In 1976, the Carter team declined to offer Ted Kennedy a speaking slot at the Democratic Convention. In 1977, Carter refused to push for Kennedy's single-payer health care bill, and the two men clashed publicly about their plans. In 1978, a young Joe Biden visited Jimmy Carter in the White House to warn him that Kennedy was making noise about running against Carter in a primary. Still, through it all, Ted Kennedy was one of the most reliable votes in the Senate and often put his personal feelings aside to convince his colleagues to support the president. But by late summer of 1979, Kennedy smelled blood in the water and decided to pick up the mantle of the Kennedy legacy and officially throw his hat into the ring.
And therefore I take the course compelled by events and by my commitment to public life. Today I formally announce that I'm a candidate for President of the United States.
All right, so let's take a step back for a second. So you've got Begin, who's building settlements in the West Bank and kind of thumbing his nose at Carter from abroad. The deposed Shah, on the run seeking safe haven while Iran fell quickly under autocratic rule. And oh, by the way, they also had access to a substantial weapons cache courtesy of the United States. The tepid nuclear agreement with the Soviet Union was extremely unpopular. Friction among Carter's staffers was palpable and increasing, and Americans were losing jobs. They're paying exorbitant prices for basic necessities, and they're waiting in line for gas. And now, Carter was going to have to spend unnecessary time and money facing off against a man who carried the most popular last name in American politics. Fortunately for Carter, on this last point, Ted Kennedy was no Bobby, and certainly no Jack. So when posed a fairly simple question, well,
why do you want to be president?
Well,
it doesn't get any better from there. It was known that Israel possessed nuclear capacity. It just wasn't spoken of or acknowledged. In October, alarm bells went off throughout the national security state. A satellite designed to detect nuclear activity indicated an explosion deep in the ocean. For weeks, the administration worked behind the scenes with allies to determine whether it was real or a malfunction. But as the weeks wore on, it became increasingly clear that a low-yield detonation had indeed occurred, and everyone was fairly certain of its origin. Israel had been running deep-water maneuvers with its partner South Africa in the Indian Ocean. Known as the Vela incident, named for the satellite detection system, the incident was buried in the official narrative and dismissed publicly to reporters who caught wind of it as a detection error. But for Team Carter, it served as an uneasy reminder that we weren't alone in the arms race. Israel wasn't a truthful partner, and they had aligned with an apartheid government that Carter had sworn to break down. Against the backdrop of a militant Iran, a shaky Soviet pact, and a million other things, the last thing that Jimmy Carter needed was Israel playing fast and loose with nuclear weapons and South Africa. It was at this moment that Carter blinked. See, ever since the Shah was deposed, David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger had been working behind Carter's back to bring the Shah to the United States. See, the Shah was sick, and he was in need of treatment, and he'd spent the better part of a year under extreme stress moving from country to country seeking safe harbor. But every country knew that Iran would retaliate in some way against any nation that offered refuge to a man they were determined to bring to justice. Now, it was true that the Shah was sick and in fact dying. But Kissinger and Rockefeller weren't motivated by compassion. You see, over the years, the Shah had funneled billions of dollars from Iran through Chase Bank in New York, where Rockefeller served as president. The status of these funds now was very much in question, but there was no question that Iran wanted it back. And then Kissinger was also taking every opportunity to make Zebig look foolish, and the pressure campaign on Carter directly and through the trilateral emissaries had reached a fever pitch. Even Hamilton Jordan and Cy Vance thought it was the right thing to do to bring the Shah back. And so Carter finally relented, and he allowed the Shah to travel to New York for treatment. Presciently and tragically, however, in a meeting with his foreign policy advisors, Carter said, quote, "What are you guys going to advise me to do if they overrun our embassy and take our people hostage?" Less than 2 weeks later, that's exactly what happened. If there was a weakness on the foreign policy team, it was in the area of Iran. By all accounts, our diplomats on the ground had a keen idea of what was bubbling below the surface in main cities like Tehran. But the Carter team was content with the status quo under the Shah. Carter's only determined policy was to cajole the Shah into improving his record on human rights, a message the Shah received with some annoyance, as Carter's Republican predecessors never seemed to care. Both Brzezinski and Vance, quote, urged Carter to make Iran an exception to the administration's new policy of restricting arms sales to non-democratic regimes with poor human rights records. Over the next 2 years, the administration gave a green light to most of the Shah's weapons purchases, end quote. As Byrd writes in retrospect, quote, all of this was a mistake. Now, in fact, the administration did have some insight and feedback into what was going on the ground in the streets of Iran. U.S. Ambassador to Iran William Sullivan had been sounding the alarm for months and getting nowhere. Vance and Zebig appeared to either downplay or outright ignore his warnings. But Sullivan was no shrinking violet and would frequently tear into his colleagues with profanity and eventually take a go-it-alone strategy. But it was too little too late. Right-wing religious students swarmed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, overwhelmed the guards, and took 66 people inside hostage.
The American Embassy in Tehran is in the hands of Muslim students tonight. Spurred on by an anti-American speech by the Ayatollah Khomeini, they stormed the embassy, fought the Marine Guards for 3 hours, overpowered them, and took dozens of American hostages.
While Khomeini had not sanctioned the embassy takeover, the students who seized it were responding to his calls to action, and he subsequently embraced the situation. See, he immediately understood the significance of the American bargaining chips. Initially, 66 Americans were held captive. Some escaped, others were released, but 52 remained. And for the next 444 days, every news channel carried images and updates of the 52 captured Americans. Morning, day, and night. 1979 wasn't through with Jimmy Carter yet. In the midst of the hostage situation in Iran, Zebig forwarded a disturbing intelligence report to Carter. The Russians had moved a significant number of military advisors to Afghanistan and appeared ready for a full-scale invasion. Carter was in disbelief. With the SALT II treaty hopes barely alive in Congress, an unprovoked invasion by the Soviets would put the nail in the coffin and signal a troubling turn in Soviet aggression that appeared to be mellowing. In reality, the Soviets were injecting themselves into a situation in which they already played a significant role. As Byrd writes, quote, when Soviet troops were airlifted into Kabul on Christmas morning, ironically, they did so in order to depose a ruthless communist in favor of a moderate communist who might have more credibility in Afghan society, end quote. You see, the Soviets saw this as an internal matter, and it would be quick and easy. Sound familiar? They had no idea that their occupation would not only last 10 years, but that they would retreat with nothing to show for it at the end of their empire. Candidate Jimmy Carter had accused President Gerald Ford of running a Rose Garden campaign in 1976. The slight here is that Ford was using the trappings of the Oval Office and the Rose Garden bill signings to leverage the power of incumbency. The idea being that the more Americans view the president in presidential settings, the harder it is for them to imagine them out of office. And it's a real thing. What Carter couldn't have foreseen was his own Rose Garden campaign year. From the moment the hostages were taken in November of 1979, Carter committed himself 100% to their safe return to the United States. As we now know, of course, they did all indeed return on the day of Ronald Reagan's inauguration. While Jimmy Carter and team worked day and night devising plans to save the hostages, the Republicans were organizing. Somehow, after a disastrous 1979, Carter still came into the next decade with relatively decent approval ratings. But there was a sense that everything could turn on a dime given the turbulence at the end of the year. Not to mention, inflation was continuing to creep, along with unemployment figures. With Carter tethered to the White House, Republicans were barnstorming across the country with plenty of political ammunition to throw at a defenseless Carter. It didn't help that it wasn't the only race that he was running. In order to even face the Republicans, he had to hold off a challenge from the most well-known Democrat in the country seeking to extend the Camelot legacy. So with his eyes trained on the Middle East, perhaps the biggest domestic decision to come from the Oval Office in January still related to foreign policy: the decision to boycott the Summer Olympics in Moscow. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and Brzezinski's obsession with standing tough against them led Carter to make this rather quick decision. Aside from this, the first part of the year was dedicated almost exclusively to freeing the hostages. Carter was adamant from the first moments of the hostage crisis that he wouldn't consider any retaliation against Iran that would imperil the lives of the hostages. But as the days turned to weeks and turned to months, his military and foreign policy advisors began to wear him down to consider an incredibly risky operation to retrieve the captive Americans. Nearly every plan was shot down by the president as they each carried great risk to both military personnel and the hostages. Every assessment placed before him carried high levels of potential casualties. Only one made it far enough for Carter to consider, and eventually he gave it the green light. The operation was notable for bringing together every branch of the armed services. The terrain, the distance, the complications. Securing the hostages required every mode of transport and included embedded operatives from the intelligence community. Everything about the plan signaled risk. Divisions among Carter's foreign policy team were customary by this time, and the loudest voice in opposition to any such plan was from Cy Vance. Vance, who'd been working overtime twisting diplomatic channels from King Hussein of Jordan to the PLO, had burned out and took a few days in April to recover from gout. In his absence, Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher, who would later serve as Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, sat in on the briefings when it was decided to greenlight Eagle Claw. Christopher left Vance in the dark. The operation was doomed from the start. At the rendezvous point in the desert, only a few of the helicopters and large air transports even made it. The conditions were a nightmare. Having spent most of the reserve fuel to get to this juncture, the helicopters were in need of refueling. So in a sandstorm, the crews attempted refueling maneuvers when things went terribly wrong, and there was a collision that set the cargo plane and a helicopter ablaze. 5 Air Force crew members and 3 Marines died horrifically in the fire, and the mission was aborted. Ayatollah Khomeini called it an act of God. Back in the White House, the Carter team was despondent. Brzezinski was uncharacteristically quiet, saying later, quote, "The president looked as if someone had stabbed him," end quote. Jordan left the Oval Office and threw up in the president's private bathroom. Jody Powell stared at a blank page, wondering which words to write for the president. Vance handed in his resignation. Eagle Claw would be likened internally and in the media to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Carter, in fact, ordered the speechwriting team to retrieve President Kennedy's remarks from this time. Ironically, while all hell was breaking loose on the ground in Iran and reminding everyone of the Cuban invasion, another storm was once again brewing in Cuba. After a bombing incident in Havana in March, thousands of Cubans sought refuge in the Peruvian embassy. President Carter, perhaps so entrenched in the hostage crisis or maybe just seeing people in need, declared that the United States would take in up to 3,500 asylum seekers. Until this point, the Carter and Castro teams had actually been in rather productive dialogue behind the scenes about normalizing relations. But Castro took this offhanded move by the president as a terrible offense. As Bird writes, quote, "Castro responded by brazenly announcing that anyone who wished to leave his communist paradise could do so by boat from the harbor in Mariel, a small town 25 miles west of Havana. Suddenly, hundreds of boats from South Florida manned by anti-Castro Cuban Americans began showing up in Mariel, offering to ferry Cuban refugees to Florida. Between April and October 1980, an estimated 125,000 Cubans reached Florida shores, including thousands of criminals whom Castro released from Cuban prisons, end quote. The criminal element of mass migration from Cuba would be immortalized in the 1984 Brian De Palma film, Scarface. The Rose Garden strategy was actually wearing Carter down. But for a man many considered to be a lousy politician, Jimmy Carter still knew a thing or two about campaigning, and he still had believers around him, chief among them, his wife. Rosalind and scores of faithful emissaries of the Carter campaign fanned out across the country while the president racked up long days and sleepless nights in the office that began to feel like a prison. The Kennedy team, which had been running a lackluster campaign that relied on boosting the Kennedy name and criticizing inflation, didn't see it coming. Right off the bat, Carter took the Iowa caucus, then the New Hampshire primary. He shredded Kennedy throughout the South. By the time Kennedy's stomping grounds of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York came around, it was already a foregone conclusion. While the delegate count gave the appearance of a competitive race, with the large coastal blue states going Kennedy's way, Carter filled in the rest of the map and handily took 36 states. And with that, the country finally closed the book on Camelot. The momentary boost in polling helped Carter during the convention, but his numbers flagged just as fast the following month. By this time, both inflation and unemployment were runaway trains, and all Carter seemed to have done was make things worse by appointing a Federal Reserve chair determined to drive the country into a deep recession. And while the Democrats were bloodying one another in primaries and siphoning off money and resources, the Republicans were coalescing around their man, Ronald Reagan.
With a deep awareness of the responsibility conferred by your trust, I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
It was thought that Reagan was too conservative for American politics. As a governor and on the campaign trail, Reagan was pure right-wing. And as Jimmy Carter sunk deeper and deeper into the hostage crisis with inflation raging throughout the world, Reagan's politics began to matter less than the optimism and perceived strength that he promoted without the pressures of being in the job. Reagan went on to best his opponents to capture the nomination, with former CIA Director George H.W. Bush coming in a distant second, but sewing up the VP slot. It was one of the most devastating electoral victories in recent history. Reagan won 44 states over Carter. It was a new decade and a new chapter for America. Carter was determined in his last hours as president to exert every ounce of strength to liberate the hostages. By noon on Sunday, January 18, Carter had signed the necessary documents. In the final moments, the president holed himself up in the Oval Office for most of the next 48 hours. Carter did not sleep. Quote, told that the hostages had boarded 2 planes and were sitting on a runway, awaiting permission to take off, Carter asked Phil Wise to place a call to Governor Reagan, who was staying across the street in Blair House. Carter wanted to give him the good news. But a few minutes later, Wise returned to say that the call had been intercepted by Reagan's aides, who reported that the president-elect was sleeping and was not to be disturbed, end quote. When the two men met in the Oval Office, Carter would later reflect that the incoming president had no questions and took no notes. The only time he interjected was during a conversation about South Korea, when the president-elect said that he was envious of the way South Korea was able to forcefully put down dissent. Needless to say, it was a new day. Despite Carter's insistence that they manage the most transparent transition possible to show good faith, the new Republican staffers had little interest in continuity. As the core remaining Carter officials were ushered out of the White House by military escorts, Jordan noticed that all the photographs of Carter had already been replaced. Days later on the inaugural platform, Carter had only one thing on his mind: the hostages. Draft after draft of the negotiations between the U.S. and Iran had been changed to suit Khomeini's whim. But as usual, everything came down to money, and to the powerful cadre of bankers behind the scenes who had their own interests at heart. David Rockefeller was intimately involved in the negotiations. The same person who helped contribute to the overthrow of the embassy by pressuring the administration to harbor the Shah was now protecting the interests of Chase Bank and prolonging the crisis. With all of the political details out of the way, it came down to the interest rates that US and European banks were willing to pay Iran on the reclaimed funds. In the end, the lawyers and bankers, as well as Khomeini, got what they wanted. Only then were the documents signed. Again, Byrd. Quote, sitting on the inaugural platform, Carter had asked the Secret Service to keep him informed on the status of the hostages. He was still standing on the platform when a Secret Service agent informed him that an Algerian jetliner carrying all 52 hostages had taken off from Tehran, bound for Algiers. Carter called it, quote, one of the happiest moments of my life, end quote. Carter's first official duty as a citizen was to travel to meet the hostages. He knew all of their names. Jimmy Carter has held on to the belief that the hostage crisis cost him the election. In reality, it was more likely that inflation was the ultimate culprit. Now, there's no question that the hostage crisis hung around his neck, but his old friend Burt Lance's warnings that Paul Volcker's maneuvers would mortgage his re-election chances was probably closer to the truth. Most Americans understood that any strategy other than the diplomatic means Carter employed would have ended in disaster, and that would have tarnished his legacy forever. That the Iranians chose to release the hostages on Inauguration Day in the U.S. was clearly to spit in Carter's face. But the reality was that the negotiations weren't going to be concluded prior to the election. One of the most infamous hostages was Michael Matrinko, who spent most of his time in Iran in solitary confinement. He was outspoken, and because he was able to communicate in Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, the Iranians were suspicious of him from the start. From the release of the captives forward, the press would attempt to wrestle criticism of Carter out of the hostages to no avail. Here's how Matrinko responded.
President Carter there?
Yeah.
Do you think he didn't do enough?
No, I think he did a superb job in very difficult circumstances. He's the president I respect the most.
Jimmy and Rosalind retreated into private life back in Plains, Georgia, after flying to greet the hostages. One surprise waiting for them was that they were broke. So there was no rest in order for the exhausted president. The couple busied themselves getting the farm back in order, but what saved them financially was book publishing deals. Of all the Carters faced throughout their lives, separated during naval deployments, a failed campaign, a winning campaign for governor and a term in the governor's mansion, the trials of being the leader of the United States, what almost broke them was working together on writing their memoirs. But the couple persevered, and when asked later what the secret was to their longevity and making it through rough patches, Carter offered this.
At the end of the day, we try to become reconciled and overcome all the differences that arose during the day. We also make up and give each other a kiss before we go to sleep.
Reconciliation and a kiss goodnight. In the twilight of his years, Carter would have many opportunities to reflect on his time in office. Here's Carter from the same interview.
I would say that we did what we pledged to do in the campaign. We kept the peace, and we obeyed the law, and we told the truth, and we honored human rights.
Kept the peace, obeyed the law, told the truth, honored human rights. In fairness, and for better and worse, it was a lot more than that. The statistics and images that came to define Jimmy Carter have begun to fade as the nation reevaluates his legacy, and history has been somewhat more kind. Every president is deserving of criticism, and this series wasn't an attempt to sugarcoat or rehabilitate Jimmy Carter. His economic worldview was insufficient and outmoded. He fell for the siren song of foreign policy and took his finger off the pulse of America. He was a micromanager, and not all of those in his inner circle had his best interest at heart. But his accomplishments were many. He appointed hundreds of liberal justices that held the judiciary in check for a generation. He promoted the position of vice president to something more than a hollow appointment. He rooted out fraud and mismanagement, negotiated a landmark treaty with Panama, and built credibility in Latin America, sparked the renewable energy industry, created the concept of tying human rights to foreign aid, negotiated peace between Egypt and Israel, saved Social Security. All tough choices and policy work that come with caveats. Much was unraveled in later years. Some endure. But what lives beyond all of it is the understanding that for the briefest of moments in our history, a kind man, a good man, ran the nation. So as this good man enters the final phase of his life, with his beloved wife of 76 years by his side, a nation offers its own reconciliation and a kiss goodnight.